Bloodbath in the Border Princes, Part 9, Hunter or the Hunted. It was the way of chaos to solve all matters with force. In beastmen society, violence and strength determined the social hierarchy. It was both the will of nature and the gods of chaos that the strong would lead the weak. As a shaman, Korgir was somewhat removed from this, as his special status exempted him from the normal rites of challenge. To kill a shaman was to kill an emissary of the gods, and thus he had always watched from the sidelines as Gors and Brays fought for the glory of the dark gods and the dark woods of the earth. But a chaos coalition is a more careful thing. Korgir had formed this alliance with the Northmen, and they had brought considerable strength with them, but in their arrogance they had expected, nay demanded, to lead. It irked him intensely to be given orders by the human. After all, it had been Korgir's idea to attack Akendorf to begin with. And now he was told, by these upstarts, what to do, and this, of course, irked him. And yet he knew it would be suicide to attack the city without the Northmen, for their strength would be needed to overcome the walls. So Korgir concocted a plan. The right to rule would be settled by ritual combat, as the gods willed. Floki had naturally selected one of his more powerful lieutenants, a Norseman by the name of Gunnar. Korgir had chosen the Bestigor, Grashsak. Little did Floki know, but Korgir had secretly daubed the hide of Grashsak with strange sigils that hurt to look upon. Korgir had worked too hard to have his glory stolen out from under him at this point. The fighters entered into the ritual ring and saluted. Leadership of the Horde now stood upon this very battle. Grashsak noted with disdain that Gunnar wore several horns upon his helmet, and he made a show of bearing his own mighty horns before the fight commenced. At Korgir's instruction, the two warriors immediately engaged. The two of them traded blows, with both managing to evade or parry at just the last moment. Neither side gained much in the way of advantage, although both started to accumulate minor cuts before too long. Both leaders watched in anticipation as the fight continued, and of course, both warriors started to flag with increasing exertion. Unusually, as the fight went on, and Gunnar grew more frustrated with his beastman opponent, he became far more reckless. By contrast, Grashsak only grew more silent and focused, doing his best to dodge and evade the Norsican strikes. Gunnar raged and tried to land a strike with his axe, held in both hands this time, but somehow Grashsak anticipated the move. With one hand he parried the ponderous axe blade, and before either leader could react, Grashsak gored Gunnar to death with his horns. Gunnar was dead before his body hit the floor, and it was then that Grashsak roared with a bestial fury. Floki felt a rage building inside him, but he let it abate. Yes, the strange beastman would be in charge for now, but they would return to this problem once Akendorf burned. For his part, Korgir flashed a savage smile. The siege of Akendorf could begin as intended. Of the assembled people, it was Magnus who first jumped into action after hearing the news. "Gregory, send for your people. Tell them to arm themselves and to take refuge in the keep." The elderly wizard gave him a knowing nod and rushed from the tent with his grandsons in tow. With that matter set aside for the time being, Magnus turned to the somewhat more recovered Captain Koenigsmark. "My scouts have reported sightings of beastmen in the woods." Magnus raised an eyebrow. This was the Border Princes. There were always beastmen in the woods. "Sacrificing those too stubborn to retreat behind the safety of the walls," continued the captain. When Magnus had first taken control of the defense of the city, he had sent riders to all the neighboring farms and hamlets. Most of the peasantry were all too happy to seek refuge within the walls of Akendorf, but more than a few farmers stubbornly refused, for one reason or the other. Based on the reports of Koenigsmark, it seemed their stubbornness proved to be their death. "That seems par for the course, Captain, but you said they were attacking. Are they making a sortie against the walls?" The pistolier shook his head and produced from his pack a strange stained white cloth. "A Noblar ran into one of our outer patrols. At first I thought the Noblars meant to attack them, but the fools were panicked in waving this makeshift flag." He passed the cloth to Magnus, who looked at it quizzically. "It's a eating cloth. One used by ogres?" The contract signed between Magnus and the warlord Goldgut had seen several wagons of ogres enter Akendorf. At first, the mayor protested having so many of the brutes inside of the walls, but Magnus had planned ahead and quartered them in an empty lot near the eastern gate. They were separated, for the most part, from the rest of the people, but also hemmed in near the wall. If need be, Magnus could have his soldiers fire down on them from prepared positions. So far, there had been no problems. Grogus Goldgut was an uncanny ogre, who seemed to love money more than he loved food, and he definitely loved food. So as long as the money continued to flow into his camp, the ogres kept to themselves. But it did dawn on Magnus that something was awry. One of the food caravans of the ogres has met with an accident. The Noblars say they were attacked by beasts in the forests. These louts were sent by their masters for help. My lord, what are your orders? Magnus stepped away from the captain and looked to his map, in pensive thought. The ambush of the ogres was bad, but not fatal. Two problems, however, emerged from this situation. Firstly, if the food supplies to the ogres was threatened in any way, well, then the brutes would invariably cause trouble in their desire for food. Secondly, the beastmen are canny hunters. Perhaps they had hoped to use this ambush as a lure to drag more of Magnus's forces away from the safety of the walls. Yet, to do nothing would surely earn the ire of Goldgut and imperil the defense further. Magnus thought for a moment, and then spoke to Koningsmark. Send out a detachment of our knights and mounted crossbowmen to aid the ogres. We won't let the beastmen steal our food supplies out from under us. The ogres had found themselves in quite a pickle, perhaps the entire lunch. Their cart of precious foodstuffs had lost a wheel, and they had become stranded in some woods neighboring the town of Akendorf. It was too much even for their might to haul to the town, so in desperation they had sent some Noblars scrambling in all directions to find help. Not the most brilliant of plans, but especially since they had eaten some of the panicked creatures, but it was the best that they had to hand at the moment. Even the ogres feared the reprisals of Goldgut, and so simply stood guard as the enormous feast in the massive wagon lay before them. The gods, mostly lead belchers, hefted their massive cannons and scanned the forest around them. Some strange beast, now eaten, had been the one to damage the wheels, but that didn't mean that they were free from danger. Swarms of Noblars, some with pots for helmets, scurried about between the more serious lead belchers. From the forest, the eyes of the beastmen looked onto their tempting prize. They were, of course, the first to act. The forest came alive with the sounds of horns and feral cries as hordes of beastmen broke from cover and into the clearing. At their forefront strode a massively mutated beast. This was no normal creature, but a troll of some kind, although it was burdened by many mutations from chaos. Its warty hide almost seemed to shift as its flesh changed and swirled in the midday light. Appendages and even grotesque parodies of faces contorted in pain as the beast lumbered forward, mouth agape and drooling. Most curiously of all, however, was the great shiny mirror bound to its back by heavy iron chains. To the ogres, this was bad news, as the beast towered over even their mighty bulk. The lead lead belcher raised their cannon to target the brute, but either dark magics or simple panic saw their shots go wide. The rest of the beastmen advanced in its wake as it lumbered towards the ogre lines. For their part, the Noblars simply remained transfixed with fear, and thus stayed put. An unfortunate lead belcher was nearest to the troll, who charged into him and the barricade the lead belcher stood behind. The ogre raised his enormous gun to ward off the troll, but was merely clobbered for his trouble. Although not killed, he was stunned and left open for the others as a target. The troll's hide proved too difficult to harm, and panic was starting to set in for the ogre defenders. That was until a hunting horn sounded from the forest. Part of the Campania cavalry, the freelancers led by Reinhard Grimson, thundered into the clearing, their musician blowing the hunting horn as they did. This surprised the beastmen, but notably the troll, who was unable to stop the knights as they charged into it with lances at the ready. The sudden surprise and the power of the lances dealt a number of serious wounds to the creature, who then fled in panic away from the ogres and the knights. The sudden arrival of the knights, and the shock of seeing their champion flee, stunned the rest of the beastmen on the right flank of the battlefield, who similarly crumbled when the knights wheeled about to charge them, putting them to the rout. On the left flank, the beastmen leaders tried to rally for a charge, but the Noblars had formed themselves into a sort of crude, horde-type shield, and thus put pause to that. More hunting horns sounded in the forest, and wary of going from hunter to the hunted, the beastmen withdrew back into the dark woods, harried, of course, by the late arriving mounted crossbowmen. The ogres had been saved, but more importantly, the feast had been secured.